Hello, everyone. Welcome. Good morning, good afternoon, good evening from wherever you're calling in from. Thank you so much for joining us today. We have a few individuals still trickling in, so if you wouldn't mind sitting tight for just a moment or two, and then we'll go ahead and get started. All right, looks like we have a nice solid group so far. So welcome again, everyone, to our Dollars Up and Donors Down Optimizing Major Donor Engagement webinar. My name is Amanda Marcus from CCS Fundraising, and in partnership with AFP New Jersey, we have a wonderful webinar set up for you today. I just want to go over a few housekeeping items before we begin. So first, we welcome all questions and discussion. If you have any questions, please feel free to enter those into the chat throughout the entire presentation. Secondarily, if you'd like to partake in a question directly on today's webinar, please feel free to raise your hand on Zoom and we'll make sure to call on you. If your question doesn't get answered immediately today, we'll make sure to follow up in an email with all answers to those questions. Also, if you can please remain on mute throughout the entirety of today's webinar, unless you are speaking in discussion or answering a question, it'll be most efficient so we can hear our presenters. And please don't be offended if I do put you on mute. And then lastly, please stick around at the very end. We have 3 super quick poll questions that we'd like everyone to participate in. So thank you very much again. And I see one question I'll just acknowledge really quick. This is a 1-hour session, so we should be here until about 2 p.m. or so. Thank you again, and I'm going to turn it over to Kate Hughes at AFP.
Hi, everyone. I'm Kate. I'm AFP New Jersey's Vice President of Programming. Thanks for joining us today. And just want to give a quick thank you to CCS Fundraising for both bringing us this content and also being a loyal chapter bronze sponsor of AFP. We're really grateful to have your support, and we're grateful for the support of all of our chapter sponsors, which allow us to put on programs like this for all of you. I'm just going to briefly introduce our 2 speakers. So you can see on your screen Carolyn Chick. Carolyn is is Managing Director and on the Board of Directors of CCS. She has been with the firm for 17 years and has over 20 years of fundraising experience. We'll hear some great perspective from her. And our second speaker is Jose Barquin. Jose is the Corporate Vice President at CCS. He's got 20 years with the firm and 2 decades of fundraising experience before that. So really great background from these 2 speakers to chat with us today. So thank you both for being here with us.
Thank you.
Thanks, Kate. I will dive in. Before we get to our topic, I just wanted to provide a little bit of information about our firm. CCS is in its 75th year. We are a fundraising consulting firm that partner with nonprofits across all sectors, providing a high-level strategic advice, the design, day-to-day management and oversight of major capital and endowment campaigns. We conduct about 300 to 400 feasibility studies a year and development audits and assessments. And data analytics and modeling is a growing part of our business that we're doing more and more. So we're sort of a full services fundraising consulting firm. We partner with roughly 500 nonprofits each year. So our team of more than 300 directors are scattered throughout the United States, Europe, and many other countries. I think the last check, we were in about 33 countries. So we are truly an international firm. Just to offer you a selection of our CCS New Jersey clients, we've highlighted here a few. You'll see our work with some of the independent schools like Del Barton and Montclair Kimberly Academy. In higher education, Rutgers, St. Peter's University, Seton Hall University. Environmental, we're working with New Jersey Audubon. Arts and cultural, Jose's done great work with the New Jersey Symphony. In terms of faith-based, which has always been a huge portion of our business, Congregation B'nai Jeshurun, and healthcare, RWJ Barnabas. So this is just sort of calling out a selection of the few, but certainly we have decades of experience in philanthropy in New Jersey, and it continues to grow. So I will jump to our topic today, which is dollars up, donors down. So this trend of larger gifts coming from smaller amounts of donors. So I'm just going to share a little bit of data. Many of you might have seen this chart before. This is just an illustration that Americans are very generous. In 2020, Giving USA estimated that charitable giving in the US was at about $471 billion. That's its highest ever, and it's a 5.1% increase over 2019. On average, if we were to break this down to look at a daily rate, this is Americans giving $1.29 billion a day in 2020. So despite the pandemic, despite the challenges that have faced our country politically, socially, giving continues to grow. There are a number of unique considerations that made 2020 the year that it was. Certainly the cascading effects of the economy and economic fallouts from COVID-19. The racial and social justice movements generated a huge surge in giving to some of the organizations working on racial equality and social justice. The S&P grew 16.3%, which we know has a direct correlation to philanthropy in the US. This was its best year ever, not to overlook the fact that other economic indicators like GDP and unemployment rates really plummeted during the year. And finally, the CARES Act, which helped many households and organizations weather the storm, offering relief to the COVID-19 pandemic. So just some unique aspects of our previous year, and nonetheless, philanthropy continued to increase. The next slide offers data on our topic here. So this is why we're here today. Dollars up, donors down. So this trend means that a small portion of a nonprofit's donor base has an outsized effect on its fundraising results. So we saw this trend really amplified after the 2008 recession. So 2008, 2009, 2010, we saw a trend of philanthropists making fewer gifts, but in much larger amounts. So rather than writing, checks for 10 gifts across the board at modest amounts, you saw donors making 3 gifts at much more substantial amounts. And philanthropists became more sophisticated during that time. They wanted to see there was a growing request for a demonstration of ROI on their philanthropic investment. So accordingly, what we take from this, nonprofits should understand which donors contribute the majority of the funds to their organizations and develop really thoughtful plans to steward those donors. We're going to break down today's discussion into sort of 4 themes. Preparing your development office to receive major and transformational gifts, making sure all the right pieces are in place to have that process run smoothly. Stewarding and cultivating major donors, particularly while continuing to navigate, I should say, this pandemic. Diversifying your major donor pipeline and activating new major donors. Many of our nonprofits saw an increase in donor acquisition during the pandemic. Others sort of had the opposite result. But what do we do with all of these new donors? So I will speak to this first piece, which is the preparation. So first and foremost, and I will say what is probably the thorn in the sides of many of the clients that we work with is the database does not have accurate information. There are duplicate entries, there are incorrect addresses, there are people who are deceased that aren't tagged as such. So, making sure that from the outset, information, contact information for donors is being captured and recorded correctly in the donor base will help streamline the process from there. Setting up practices and processes around systematically adding new contacts into your CRM is a great practice to get into. And we know many organizations have to sort of do the tedious work of going back and just cleaning it up, but it's a good thing to do, particularly now. Once we know that's accurate and we're working with data that is correct, we would suggest doing a wealth screen fairly regularly. So at least every 3 years. With all of the donor acquisition and lapsed donors, we want to make sure the database is as refreshed as possible, and we've got accurate donor-related capacity information. Hospitals might do this more frequently than 3 years because grateful patients are constantly coming in, and those need to be screened. Higher education as well probably need to do it much more frequently as new classes come on board. And we did see, particularly for our arts and cultural organizations, a huge influx of new donors during the pandemic. So certainly would want to wealth screen those folks as well. And then doing a segmentation analysis. So now that we've got, capacity ratings on everybody, how do we make sense of this database, and what are the strategies to employ? So for your highest level donors, they each need really individualized, tailored strategies. What do we do with the mid-level donors? Are there societies or groups that exist or can be created to invite them to sort of elevate their giving? All the lower level donors, what's our strategy there that really has a good ROI? And we'll talk a little bit more later about digital strategy, but just really segmenting the database and making some sense of it so you can layer over strategy. And then, finally, monitoring annual fund appeals to understand any sudden or gradual increases in giving, and really walking through proper moves management discussions. So from discovery of a donor all the way through the solicitation and stewardship of donors. What are the steps that are being taken? What are the activity goals associated with those steps? And even maybe taking this opportunity now as we begin to hopefully emerge from this pandemic to refresh portfolios and have a real dashboard associated with them. Now, in terms of the solicitation process itself, when developing these things, we want to make sure this is thoughtful. And when you think about soliciting your major donors, each ask is almost like a mini campaign in itself. There is a tremendous amount of work that goes into making the ask at a very high amount. So naturally, we want to look at historically, what have they done at your organization? What have they done philanthropically with other organizations, so that you've got some information to inform your ask. You want to couple that together with other wealth indicators you've secured from your screening. What's the right timing? Who's the right team, either individual or team of people to make the ask? Meaning who is going to be most influential over their decision making, and then other defined roles, like who's saying what in the meeting, what's the recognition for the donor, and of course all of the materials that should be visually appealing to complement these meetings. If you are thinking about launching a campaign, oftentimes a study will help answer a lot of these questions. So, conducting a feasibility study before launching a campaign really helps to develop your GPS or your roadmap to these high-level solicitations. Just moving on to the next slide. We wanted to touch on virtual solicitations because naturally, many of us are conducting them and will continue to do so with the Delta variant rearing its head. We have seen this done really, really well. And it's so interesting to think, in March, April, May of 2020, we generally weren't suggesting very large gifts were requested over Zoom. It was sort of maybe not a pause on campaign activity, but on those big asks. But then we all, came to do business on Zoom. And we created ways to make these conversations really intimate and personal. So like I said, we've seen this done really well. Just a few really important things in terms of, being clear about what you want your donor to get out of the meeting and sort of working backwards from there, defining what that is. Using the time to update the donor, to collaborate, to engage the prospect in conversation throughout by posing particular questions, making sure it's not just a presentation like this on the screen and a one-way conversation, making it multi-sensory. So we've seen videos done during the presentation of a gift solicitation, as well as just sort of gallery view discussion. Really taking the opportunity to make the donor feel like this is a highly personalized conversation. This presentation was prepared just for them. And lastly, I would say, we could probably all write a book on the technology hiccups we've had on Zoom throughout the pandemic. So just, of course, making sure all the tech pieces are ironed out and you anticipate any challenges that you might come across. So I think at this moment, we want to take a quick poll. So something's going to pop up on your screen and you'll have the opportunity to answer. What best practices have you discovered while conducting virtual solicitations throughout this past year?
And for anyone unfamiliar with Poll Everywhere, you're just going to text the numbers 22333 to CCS Fundraising 252, and you'll be able to participate.
Thank you, Amanda. Amanda, are we reviewing those answers now, or are we circling back to that?
You will see them appear on the screen once they begin submission. So it's pretty much automatic.
Okay. Be concise. Just to talk through these as they come in. People don't read much anymore, and want to cut through it, particularly on Zoom. It's good advice. Role play with solicitation team in advance. This is a really good one. We do a lot of role playing when we prepare our clients for solicitations. It allows the team who's soliciting to walk into the room when it's time to feeling really, even the Zoom room, feeling really confident in their role and their talking points, and also to anticipate where they might, blunder, or which parts make them uncomfortable, or what questions might be asked, so that they can get ahead of that a little bit. Oh, I love this. Send a care package. So I've seen, dinner and wine sent. We've seen, breakfast and coffee and that kind of thing. So just like you would prepare for somebody with an in-person meeting, sending a little package, especially with some organizational merchandise, is nice. Amanda, should we, just in the interest of time, should we move forward?
Absolutely.
Well, and I imagine these will continue to be captured. We could maybe circle back if we've got time.
Yeah, definitely. We'll have everything captured to assure that all answers can be recognized later on.
Terrific. All right, Jose, I'm going to pass it to you to talk through stewardship.
Thank you, Caroline. I've got so many thoughts going through my head that were just stirred up by that presentation, Caroline. And I think I will say this first and foremost. We didn't really acknowledge this at the outset, but The registrants for this webinar come from Argentina, Kenya, Canada, and across these United States, California, Massachusetts, Pennsylvania, Connecticut, Ohio, Washington, Colorado, Michigan, Kentucky, Maryland, New York, across all sectors. And especially as we sort of pause there for that poll about how to touch people and how to move people, I'm just so impressed by what AFP New Jersey has done here in its programming and ability to use technology. I'm a proud resident of New Jersey, but I'm even more proud of what AFP is able to do to transcend boundaries to reach people who are like-minded and who are eager to learn a little bit more about the work that we all love. On the next slide, I did want to sort of start with a few initial impressions that are very, very deeply felt. And when I look at the screen, and this is going to be a PowerPoint that everyone's going to receive later, so I don't want to belabor with details, but there's certain words here that are illuminated for me after doing this for almost 40 years. Authentic, appropriate, highly personalized, deep in engagement, impact reports, providing opportunities for donors to get to know each other and the leadership. I just think, if you walk away remembering a few of those, I think you'll be a little bit better at appreciating what you've been doing with your donors for the past year and what you might aspire to moving forward. I know Caroline has some examples of where she's seen maybe some refreshing takes on some of these stewardship moments. So Caroline, maybe you can talk a little bit about some examples.
Sure, happy to. Yeah, as we were thinking this through, there are a few that I've participated in over the course of the last year that have stuck in my mind. One of them is a conversation that had an open invitation to the nonprofit constituency, and it was a conversation between a world-renowned musician and a world-renowned social activist focused on social and racial equality. And what was so interesting about it, it was the format was very intimate. It was just the two of them, their faces on the screen, talking what seemed to be very in an unscripted way about some provocative discussions, having a tie to the nonprofit, but not necessarily focused entirely on it. It was just an interesting conversation. And what was so neat about this particular event was that they allowed all the Zoom faces, as we are today, to remain on the screen. So you just had a banner at the top of your screen. You could scroll through, and there were some of the most iconic philanthropists in our country listening to this conversation. And you saw them in their living room or at their dining table. People were listening to the conversation over dinner or having a glass of wine, and it was just, it just offered so much credibility. It was like, wow, there's this person, there's that person. And this nonprofit was able to attract these people through, marketing this web-based discussion. It was just so brilliant. It's not always easy to attract, high caliber people like that, but it really, in this case, really worked out well. And I won't spend more time, but we've seen some great town hall meetings, offered to top 50 donors, type of sort of the CEO or the president or the head of school offering exclusive information to top donors, just so they had some insider access, that kind of thing. But there's certainly been no shortage of opportunities over Zoom.
Thank you, Carolyn. It's we see a lot of this text, all of us. We've gone to the bookstore and bought the fundraising 101 and even the more sophisticated publications that have evolved over the years. But I think each of us can can think about moments when we've been very comfortable and we've been very proud, where we've been a part of an organization that has a town hall gathering, and it's actually enjoyable to be a part of, as opposed to, you know, hearing everyone sitting on their green metal chairs squirming and waiting for the speaker to go to page 12. And so there's a lot to learn and a lot to reinforce. Some of these are not new ideas. And I think another recurring theme that all of us have experienced very, very deeply during this last year and a half is, in many ways, we've returned to some of the essence of who we are. And we've allowed our humanity to come out a little bit more. We're using fancy new tools. And even today, it's, you know, what's being conducted here is remarkable. No glitches so far. But again, sort of the return to that core of best practices, what we know to be effective. On this next slide, I just wanted to introduce another example. Oh, and we have a participant from Colombia. Welcome. From Colombia to Camden, New Jersey, which is, for those of you who may not be familiar with this region, it's directly across the river from Philadelphia. And it's a remarkable story of another city that used to be at the heart of the industrial tradition in the Northeast in particular. And over the years, Rutgers University has invested heavily, along with businesses who have also wanted to make sure that Camden recaptures some of that glory and presence. In 2019, CCS was invited down amidst some significant transition on the campus to help come in and stabilize the development department. They were at the very early stages of their $2 billion university-wide capital campaign. So there was case development that still needed to be teased out. And then the pandemic hit. And again, not a lot of rocket science here, but one of the again, wonderful examples here that resulted in the second highest fundraising year in its history. And the largest gift ever being part of that drive, was just basic human nature, staying with a donor, being patient, watching the stock market, which he was doing every hour. He initially indicated this would be a bequest and was very insistent that it remain so. And over a 6 to 9 month period, we just slowly brought him more and more examples of leadership, not just on campus, but across the university. Again, illuminating our case. In this instance, he was very, very interested and wanted to be more educated on what was happening with the underserved and attending law school in particular, for which Rutgers is known. Again, I think the pandemic may have opened up avenues in his own thinking where he finally acknowledged that he didn't have to wait, and that his gift would probably be leveraged 2, 3, 10 times more if he made a cash gift now. And sure enough, it did. It was a $3.5 million cash pledge. And subsequent to that, we also motivated another donor, major gift donor, who's very loyal also for scholarships, to make a $1.3 million gift. So, you know, the storyline here is involving people besides yourself. I know everyone on this call is professional and brings years of experience and is deeply devoted to its mission. But there are moments where you do have to sort of pivot and see if you have other members of your team that you can bring to the fore, and maybe just give the donor another reminder of why this gift right now matters. I think that in the end, which is so often the case, right? this was about courageous leadership and being authentic. And it's a recurring theme for me, especially in the last year and a half, what I've seen, both for myself with my clients, but across CCS and across the country, frankly. We're watching people become inspired to do something that they know is going to have a lasting impact. And for those of you who have used those phrases in your fundraising pitches, they might sound like a cliche from time to time, but there are moments, and I think we are in one right now. And Caroline referenced initially, we'll see it again later on, what happened when people were frankly caught off guard and had to go home, had to leave campus, had to sit in front of a computer and still do work. We're very pleasantly surprised how quickly people adapted and actually started to enjoy what was occurring. And before I switch the slide, just one more example. At Rutgers, when we all went home, the alumni office continued to reach out, as you can imagine, rather aggressively to let their constituents know that we were okay, our students were okay. The mission continues, stay tuned for further plans and instructions. They still had alumni gatherings, and for the first time, I think, in over 20 or 30 years, that the alumni office had been sending out these announcements for alumni gathering. This was going to be one of the first ones that was on Zoom, right? And I think 70% of the participants had never attended an alumni event in their life since graduating. So, unearthing a cohort of donors in your pipeline that have been sitting there probably for decades because of the pandemic, it's an interesting conversation, right? So again, Caroline's examples, Camden's examples, when you break it down and there's a thoughtfulness, there's a purpose and a meaning to what you're about to propose, things are usually going to happen for you. So on this next slide, we move into diversify, and you can continue on here. So, this is one of my favorite slides. I'm not going to spend too much time on it, but print this up, put it over your computer. I can't tell you how long this data has been elusive for some people to wrap their arms around. Numbers like this just sort of help to move aside some of the reservations and reticence that we've seen with people using old stereotypes and old information that we're all susceptible to carry forward. This is just a wonderful, wonderful, elegantly simple snapshot that all of us can use to build on. And the next slide here. I just want to read some of these, and I know we're about to have another poll, but I think it's exceedingly important, if you are committed to diversify your portfolio and your organization, frankly, is that you be vulnerable and you be honest with yourself enough to imagine that you can actually embrace being accountable. That phrase tends to have a punitive connotation to it. Oh no, who did this? Who's accountable? And instead, it's like, I want to be accountable for introducing this topic in my organization. And I want to suggest to my vice president that I'd like to enrich my portfolio and look at a cohort of prospects that, frankly, this organization has not been ignoring, but just hasn't been seeing, maybe for years, maybe for decades. And there's the aspiration, and then there's the tactical approach. And I think as we move forward, we're going to see more and more honesty about drilling down and applying best practices and technology, as Caroline has mentioned, which is already being evidenced. We're watching people being hired in organizations. We're watching billions of dollars being directed towards diversity and DEI, the catchy phrase as of late. And I think organizations are starting to feel more and more comfortable that's working its way down for an executive director to talk to their board and say, we need to go in this direction, and use data to support the case and less stereotype and history to fall back on. So, you know, in this next poll, I really like to hear and see responses from Colombia and Argentina, as well as from Detroit and Washington, on how people embrace this. Amanda, do we have any cool music we can play while we're waiting for this?
That's a great idea. Let me see what I can do. Please, everyone, feel free to begin submitting to this poll everywhere again. You'll follow the same steps.
I like this. I mean, there's so many thoughts popping up, and I love each one. Bilingual and multilingual staff. We see that a lot, frankly, here in the United States, where organizations that are very effective and raise money, but it tends to be from the same community, and board diversity starts at the top, right?
Jose, one thing I noticed, and it's related to one of these comments about educating ourselves on cultural differences. I've done an enormous amount of Chinese fundraising, and there are so many considerations that one might not think of unless that and I'll just speak for myself. I really educated myself on the motivations and, you know, just important factors that go into fundraising from Chinese natives and expats. You know, and that we've also done studies on motivations behind African-American giving, which was helpful and insightful and eye-opening. These are really important things.
Oh, and thank you for that. And AFP has been a leader in this area as well over the years, looking at various constituencies and how they view philanthropy. You know, I'm of Cuban origin, and I've lived in Asia, and I've watched a cultural preference to have philanthropy conveyed through the church, for example. In some instances, you would never think of approaching an individual and asking him for a gift or her for a gift, but unless you were running a church or a school affiliated with a church. I know that's maybe perhaps an older example, but getting back to that slide, which I think is remarkable, Carolyn's, how across all the groups that were surveyed, you know, there's unanimity in generosity. Learning to speak the language literally and spiritually is really what's key, and educating ourselves, again, is really incumbent. It's an imperative. So thank you for these initial comments, and again, please keep them coming. We want to make sure that we build on this presentation today, and this is just scratching the surface. And, you know, in an hour. So thank you all for that. And then just very briefly, taking all of this at 30,000 feet and how do you activate it? This next slide really reaffirms some of the observations that you've heard us referencing to date. For me, it's just, again, a wonderful example of philanthropy in this country. And we know how fortunate we are, that 471 billion. And we've seen this with wars, we've seen this with tsunamis, with recessions, 9/11. At each of these moments, we as fundraisers thought, oh, we have to stop doing what we're doing because everyone's going to give money to 9/11 or everyone's going to give money to the tsunami. And in fact, what happens is people don't stop giving where they're giving, they just dig deeper for the cause because it means something. Here we are again, most of us at home, and look at these numbers, 72% of respondents who held virtual major gift solicitations found them to be either as successful or more successful. I guarantee you that when you started fundraising, I know I'll speak for myself, you could not go into your boss and say, look, I want to go solicit someone, but I don't want to go to his office. I want to do it over the phone. You would be fired, or you would have been, sternly reprimanded for even thinking that, and critiqued for lack of imagination and being personable. Well, guess what? That chapter has now evolved, hasn't it? It's not a replacement for this face-to-face, but it's another tool, and we're adapting. And many of us have individual stories, I'm sure, and maybe you can share those in the subsequent polls of where this virtual solicitation was actually a blessing and actually enhanced your chances of being successful and getting a major gift. And on the next slide, again, this is a reaffirmation. Again, as long as I've been watching the Bank of America study, U.S. Trust, and it's about mission. Caroline mentioned ROI, impact. There's various iterations of that over the last certainly 10 to 15 years with younger philanthropists coming into the fold. It's not that long ago for some of us where you had to be a Carnegie or a Rockefeller and in your 70s or 80s before you made your transformational gift. Now we're seeing it when people are in their 30s and 40s. Different phase of their life, different view of the world, but ultimately mission is the prominent factor. In some instances, tax benefits come into play over a multi-year pledge, and you add more zeros, 8, 9-figure, 10-figure pledges. They come into play, but I think that's just a necessary evil rather than a motivational or inspirational driver. But again, it's good to go back to this because sometimes we get lost in the moment when we're creating a strategy for a donor, and we get swayed to start believing our own hype. And then the next slide here, again, very much in keeping with what we've been referencing with this new era that we're in the midst of. Social media users, some organizations are, levels above others, and that's fine. Others are still at ground level, trying to adapt and utilize Facebook and, as an example. And then there's everything in between. But the reality again is, there's a generation of Americans who are, walking around with this. If it's not attached to your hip, if it's not in your, jacket, if it's not sleeping next to your bed, you're different, right? So people are becoming increasingly comfortable with doing a lot of their business on a cell phone, on a laptop, and why not fundraising? Why not make a gift accordingly? I'm not going to belabor this point because everyone here understands that this doesn't happen overnight. For those of you who have a sophisticated team of techies to help elevate this, God bless you. For those of you who don't, I think you can still break it down to some best practices, doing a sort of general audit of your social media capabilities and look at your peer and aspirant organizations, find out where they are, what kind of technology they're using, what kind of strategies they've adopted, look at their websites. Where's your website? This goes into branding and all similar facets of the way you show yourself to your constituents, your donor base, your community. So I think we have Caroline here to sort of try to help us wrap up all this rat-a-tat examples and highlights we've been sharing with you, and just sort of break it down into some key takeaways.
Thanks, Jose. Yeah, I will just very briefly summarize some of these points and then we'll open for questions. Key takeaways. So extensive preparation to set your team up for success. So whether it's virtual or in person, making sure the team is well informed and educated on the prospect, that the materials are polished, that roles have been defined and rehearsed, and particularly with virtual solicitations, that it comes across clear and compelling. In terms of database mining, if you haven't done it recently, now's a good time to do it. A key best practice is just consistent implementation of data analytics and modeling. And then from that, diversify, from that information, from the data mining, diversifying your fundraising approach. So a highly tailored personal approach for those few donors that make up probably the majority of the giving to your organization, but not forgetting ways to engage and elevate your mid-level donors, and perhaps developing a digital strategy for your lower level donors. So social media, digital direct mail, all of those kinds of things to engage and retain new donors. And take advantage of the tools that we've all become pros at during this pandemic, all of the different virtual platforms, polling, surveying, all of those types of things have been helpful to move through, donor engagement through solicitation. So with that, we will open for questions and answers, and perhaps I can address Juanita's question first, which came in through the chat quite a while ago. Juanita, welcome. You're from Colombia. Juanita asked the basic steps to prepare for a successful virtual meeting. So, generally speaking, we would approach this as we would an in-person meeting. So doing all of the homework in terms of the donor research, all of the indicators that will help inform what you're asking for, developing a proposal, a nice looking, deck that is personalized to them. It has the ask in it. There's a specific number, there's a gift structure, all of those components that make a major gift ask compelling to a donor. And then getting together via Zoom to rehearse it and doing a dry run. We talked about technology hiccups, really doing a dry run, anticipating questions or where things might not seem as fluid over Zoom as they would in somebody's office or living room. And sharing your screen so the proposal can be up, but removing it when there's discussion, so it's a little bit more intimate, and sending the proposal to the donor in the aftermath of the conversation. We always want to be able to walk a donor through the proposal without having them read it on their own and interpret it how they would interpret it. without you complementing the proposal with your own talking points. So sending it to them in the aftermath so they can mull it over again would be a good practice. But generally speaking, it's not too dissimilar from an in-person meeting. Other questions?
We had another question just pop up in the chat from Chanel. Thanks so much for participating. Chanel asked, what challenges have you observed when learning more leaning more into the technology?
Jose, feel free to add to this, but I would just say very quickly, it depends on how comfortable the person that you are trying to communicate with is with the technology. I mean, I think everybody who made it to this webinar is fairly well versed at this point in Zoom. We've had donors and board members who are maybe more on the elderly side, who aren't as familiar or tech savvy, and it's been a little bit of a challenge. FedExing hard copies is always a good idea. Should the person on your receiving end not be able to make it work?
Yeah, so thank you, Carolyn. I just want to share, Carolyn and I have worked together for, well over 15 years. And I remember in particular one instance, we had a hurricane up here in the Northeast, and we were without power for maybe 5 to 7 days, depending on where you lived. And I was working with Caroline on a project. I was struggling with my technology here. I'm maybe 10 miles from her, if that, 5 miles. She, meanwhile, was in her parking, in her driveway, engine running, kids, crying for her in the house, generating a PowerPoint presentation that needed to be to the client. Again, I was over here just trying to feed my family, so it's a tribute to the spirit of wanting to get something done at whatever level you can. FedExing hard copies is a fallback. On this presentation, I trust technology, but I always, I've learned this years ago, bring a hard copy because something might happen. But on a higher level, and I'm not as familiar with where you are in your organization as far as investing in technology. But again, I do think it would be a good opportunity for you right now to sort of look at some of those organizations that you are hoping to model yourself after. And then ones that are currently looking at you rather enviously, like you must be doing something really magical, and look at the investments in software, look at the investments in staff. Do you have IT staff? Do you sub that out to a service? I mean, I think we've gotten to a point in our lives where services are available for virtually anything through a subcontract. So you don't have to hire a full-time IT person if you can, a senior IT person, that is, if you can contract out the service to an organization and a company that's 24/7 responsive. But I do think, I think this gets to your core, about leaning in technology. Technology is not a replacement for this. It's not a replacement for you. Your donors relate to your spirit, to your ability to illuminate your mission, to your ability to evidence impact, and frankly, to answer the question, why are we relevant and why should you continue to support us? It's because you matter. And if you can use technology to help in certain areas, whether it's in your direct mail, whether it's in your major gift or special events, we could have talked about special events for hours, how organizations are adapting and being very successful in generating revenue. Wherever you need it, you just want to be very clear that you've done some type of an audit, whether it's an informal one or whether you hire someone from the outside to come in and give you candor, and recommendations on moving to where you want to. And this goes from a small church in a small town to an international health organization. CCS does this on both ends of the spectrum, and it's the same issues, just wider bandwidth, bigger scale. So, assessment, audit.
And does anyone else have any other questions you'd like to ask? Please feel free to do that now. I think we might have time for one more. All right, great. Well, for everyone who does have any remaining questions, again, please feel free to send those afterward. In addition, we will be sending a recording of this webinar, as well as the deck that was shared earlier. As I mentioned in the beginning, we do have a very brief poll, if you wouldn't mind participating in. And again, thank you on behalf of CCS Fundraising in partnership with AFP New Jersey for attending our webinar today. Thank you again, everyone.